Welcome everyone to the Children's Mental Health Matters webinar series. My name is Angie McRae. I'm the Child and Family Engagement Manager here at the Mental Health Association of Maryland. Today's session is being recorded and will be made available to you in the coming week. Our speaker today is Dr. Fanita Tyrell, Assistant Professor, Department of Psychology at the University of Maryland. She'll be presenting Multisystem Resilience, the processes that promote positive youth development in the context of stress and adversity. Dr. Fanita Tyrell is an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology and a faculty affiliate of the Department of African American and Africana Studies at the University of Maryland at College Park. She is also the director of the Resilient Adaptation Across Culture and Context Lab. Her research program focuses on elucidating processes of risk and resilience among adversity-exposed ethnic, racial, minority, and immigrant populations with a strong interest in understanding how cultural identities and experiences strengthen pathways to typical and atypical patterns of development, adaptation, and health. Her research and scholarship have been supported by the Ford Foundation, National Institute of Mental Health, Society for Research in Child Development, and American Psychological Foundation. Thank you so much for being here today, Dr. Tyrell. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Angie, for that wonderful introduction. I'm very delighted to have the opportunity to share my research with all of you, especially to the broader public. So I'm very excited to be here today. As Angie said, I am the director for the Resilient Adaptation Across Culture and Context Lab. In general, I study how youth and their families thrive in the face of negative life experiences. Specifically, I examine how risk processes such as experiences of discrimination and parental psychopathology undermine youth's development, health, and adaptation. I'm also interested in the mechanisms of resilience at multiple levels of analysis, such as effective coping strategies, which I will be talking about today, supportive parenting, social support from family and community members, and access to education, and how these factors can actually mitigate risk and promote youth successful adaptation. And because I know that processes of risk and resilience may actually vary across culture, I also look at how cultural processes such as how a parent socialize their children, their different types of cultural identities, orientations, and values strengthen pathways to typical and atypical patterns of development. And in my work, I adopt a multi-system approach to resilience. What that means is that I believe that the capacity of an individual or system to adapt successfully to challenges that threaten their survival or adaptation depends on the resilience of many other systems and processes that are both internal to them, so biologically and psychologically, and external to that person or organism, such as the social and cultural processes that are surrounding them. And that resilience is actually dynamic and continually changes as a function of interaction across systems at multiple levels over the life course. And so take, for example, the COVID-19 pandemic. To adapt well during the pandemic, individuals, families, community resilience depended on many interconnected systems. We rely on our immune system, to vaccines, supply chains, to provide food, Zoom and broadband technology to communicate and continue to do the works that we needed to do. During COVID, kids depended on their family, school, and community resources, as well as their individual immune system to do well despite exposure to a major health crisis. And so the point is that to survive and to adapt to different types of stress, we need to rely on not only skills that are internal, or mechanisms that are internal to us, but we also need to rely on things that are in our environment and the relationships we have in order to navigate stressful life experiences. So today, I will discuss findings from my research program that highlights how different systems within and outside the individual shape their resilience and adaptation. First, I will discuss the impact of ethnic racial socialization, which I'm going to talk about what that means on youth adjustment in the context of both positive and negative family environments. And then I will discuss the role of stress physiology in resilient adaptation. And finally, I will end the talk by showing that positive relationships with parents, both mothers and fathers, are actually crucial to the development of effective coping strategies, especially in terms of navigating race-related stress. And so a lot of my work focus on how the family environment, cultural and social context actually shape youth development. And in one of my papers, I look at how the family climate actually influence parents' socialization and youth psychological well-being. And from this literature, we have seen that numerous studies have shown that ethnic racial socialization, or what we call ERS or RES, depending on the scholars that do this work, is essentially culturally relevant processes for families of color, because it teaches youth about their heritage and help them maintain a positive sense of self while providing them with the tools they need to actually navigate ethnic racial stressors. And in general, research has actually shown that messages focusing on cultural pride are associated with positive psychological adjustment for youth. However, there are mixed findings about the benefits of messages focusing on preparing youth for racial discrimination and conveying messages about mistrusting others from other ethnic racial groups. And these mixed findings are consistent with the argument that preparation for bias or promotion of mistrust are context dependent. That is, although some of these messages may be adaptive in some contexts to prepare youth for racism, message alerting youth to racial bias and encouraging them to mistrust those from other groups could actually foster hypervigilance, worry, or anxiety about being targeted or expecting unfair mistreatment from others. And so it is really important to try to examine conditions under which these messages may actually be beneficial and harmful, and understanding ERS messages in the context of the family climate may actually provide insight into understanding this. And so one of the goals of our study was trying to look at the moderating role of family climate in influence this association between ethnic racial socialization and anxiety for African American and Latina college students. And so when we think about ethnic race or socialization, we're talking about a social, cognitive, and developmental process where children actually learn about beliefs, social norms, values, and behaviors about their race, ethnicity. And dimensions of ethnic racial socialization usually includes cultural socialization, which is the transmission of cultural values and traditions. It's the idea that parents try to instill cultural pride into their children. And then you have preparation for bias, which is teaching children how to cope with experiences of discrimination. And then you have promotion of mistrust, which are practices that emphasize the need to be wary of members from different ethnic racial groups. And one of the things that we see is that parents are actually foundational to this process, that they're the key conveyor of ethnic racial socialization in children and adolescents. But I have to also emphasize that kids also learn about these messages from their siblings, from other family members, from the media and other sources, but parents are supposed to lay the foundation when it comes to learning about these messages. And so the extent to which ethnic racial socialization are associated to adjustment may actually vary based on the aspect of family climate. And so when I talk about family climate, I'm talking about family cohesion, which is the emotional togetherness or closeness and bonds that you often see between family members, or family conflict, which is the opposition that you often see between family members, so engage in a lot of arguments. And what we've actually seen is that these family climate may actually set the stage for transmission of ethnic racial socialization messages. So, for example, families that are more highly bonded may be more likely to communicate with their children about their cultural heritage and potentially discriminatory experiences that children may actually encounter. But there's some support for this argument, with research actually showing that parents who reported more positive and warm relationships with their children were actually more likely to engage in cultural socialization and preparation for bias. But when we compare that to negative family environments or high levels of family conflict, ERS messages may not be communicated as frequently. And when they're communicated, they could be rejected or ignored because of the level of hostility between family members. Okay. And so one of the things we also know in the literature is that ethnicity and race influence engagement in ethnic racial socialization messages. For example, in Latinx families and in immigrant families, they're actually more likely to engage in cultural socialization messages when compared to other ethnic racial groups. Whereas messages promoting cultural pride and bias preparation are equally salient among African Americans, but ERS messages focus on preparing youth for discrimination and racism are less common among Latinx and Asian American families when we compare them to African American families. And in fact, when you actually for Asian American families, when they're socialized to engage in promotion of mistrust, they often are taught to be weary of other ethnic racial minorities. Okay, and so despite these ethnic racial differences, little is known about the association between ethnic racial socialization and anxiety, and how they actually may vary across different ethnic racial groups. But the emerging literature on ERS and socialization also has produced kind of mixed findings, with some researchers actually finding no significant differences between, for instance, African American and Latinx youth, whereas some researchers actually found differences. And there is even less evidence about how the family climate may actually impact this association between ethnic racial socialization and anxiety. And so our study was supposed to examine the associations between ethnic racial socialization, so looking at cultural socialization, preparation for bias, and promotion of mistrust. And I also want to highlight that there's other types of socialization practices. For example, egalitarianism is the idea that you should focus on on individual characteristics and less so on their race. It is this colorblind ideology that race doesn't matter. And when we look at different ethnicity or racial group, white parents tend to engage more in egalitarianism compared to other types of ethnic racial socialization practices. And so, but here we were just looking at these three. And we were trying to look at how these different types of socialization practices related to anxiety, and how does the family climate actually moderate these associations between African American and Latinx college students. And so participants in this study consisted of like 142 African Americans and 5 Latinx undergraduate college students from 4 universities, 5 4-year universities in California. And so participants age range from 17 to 22, with most individuals being around the age of 18, 19. Most participants were female, as you would expected on most college campus. And the annual family income ranged from $10,000 to $100,000, with about 66% of the sample reporting family income below $60,000. And I always want to highlight that this is indeed California. Okay. And so when we look at like the correlations, this is a correlation table for both African American and Latinx youth. The findings indicate that cultural socialization and family cohesion were negatively associated with anxiety symptoms. That is, if parents actually engage more in promoting messages of cultural pride and heritage, or if individuals grew up in a family environment where that there was a lot of togetherness and bonding, that seems to be associated with lower anxiety symptoms in youth. But when they engage in a lot of preparation for bias, or teaching kids how to cope with discrimination, or telling kids that they need to be wary of other people, or grow up in a family environment that there was high level of conflict, this was actually positively associated with more anxiety symptoms. So the high family conflict, more engagement in coping with discrimination, and a promotion of mistrust was kids were more likely to have higher rates of anxiety symptoms. And so that is something that you see consistently across these two groups. Then I tried to look at the direct effects of ethnic racial socialization on adjustment, and our results suggest that after you control for a bunch of covariates like the child's gender, age, discrimination, family cohesion, or family conflict, only cultural socialization and promotion of mistrust were directly associated with anxiety. And these associations were pretty much consistent across African American and Latina youth. Next, we kind of look at whether family environment would influence the association between ethnic racial socialization and anxiety symptoms. And there was significant moderation. There was no significant moderation for preparation for bias or promotion for mistrust. And so there was only interactions that we see between cultural socialization and the family environment. And we found that under conditions of high family cohesion, families that engage in a lot of cultural socialization, youth tend to have lower anxiety symptoms. That is, if you were exposed to, if you were in a good family environment and you engage in a lot of messages that promote cultural pride, these children tend to report lower anxiety symptoms. And this was consistent across African American and Latina youth. We also actually found there was this significant interaction between cultural socialization and family conflict, and this association actually differ by ethnicity, race. So that for Latina youth, you did not see these effects, but you saw these effects for African American youth. That is, among African American youth, those who report higher levels of family conflict, if their parents or family members engage in more higher levels of cultural socialization, they also reported lower levels of anxiety symptoms. So you found this in African American youth, but not in Latina youth. And so when we look at the findings in general, we found that ethnic racial socialization have differential effects on anxiety symptoms in African American and Latina populations. Specifically, what we learn is that teaching kids how to cope with discrimination or teaching them to be wary of individuals from other ethnic racial group was associated with higher anxiety symptoms. Whereas teaching kids to have pride and positive feelings about their culture were associated with lower anxiety symptoms. And for the most part, this was actually consistent among both African American and Latina college students. What we also saw was that cultural socialization was beneficial to youth adjustment in different types of family environment. That is, in families with both high levels of cohesion and conflict, cultural socialization messages was associated with lower anxiety symptoms. But for African American young adults, but not Latina young adults, cultural socialization was associated with lower anxiety symptoms in high family conflict environment. And so to me, as a resilience researcher, these findings suggest that cultural socialization is a promotive factor, that it did not matter whether it was a negative or positive family environment. Cultural socialization, engaging in messages that promote heritage and cultural pride, would be associated with lower anxiety symptoms in children. So what are the implications for this type of research? Well, a lot of family focused interventions, they tend to focus on encouraging families to spend time with children, and encourage family to promote bonding and positive relationships. And that's very good, right? These interventions that focus on family bonding and family relationships are good, but they should also consider encouraging families to spend time with children, speaking about their cultural values and background, and engaging in cultural activities and practices, because engaging in these cultural socialization practices can actually promote youth mental health. Okay. And so I always include, when I'm speaking to the public, include strategies to promote culture, pride, heritage, and traditions. And that could include encouraging, having your kids engage in storytelling. So a lot of books these days actually include cultural stories. And so buying books that is actually going to speak to some of the traditions that the traditions and values that you actually experience is a good thing. Eating and sharing traditional foods, attending cultural events and festivals, or having art representing your culture in your home is important. But also have kids listen to cultural music and speak to children in your native languages. That will actually increase pride in children. So, in addition to kind of looking at how family environment, social context, and cultural processes are related to mental health outcomes, I've been focusing on the role of stress physiology in resilient adaptation. And I became interested in the role of stress physiology in resilient adaptation when I read this paper published in 2013 by Gene Brody and his colleagues at University of Georgia. And the title of the paper was, "Is Resilience Only Skin Deep?" And in his paper, he argued that there's a subset of resilient individuals. So prior to this paper, what we as resilient researchers would do is try to understand how people are functioning compared to their other peers on different behavioral indicators. So we would look at how they are doing with their friends, how well are they doing at work, how well are they engaging in criminal activities. We do, how are they performing on dimensions of anxiety and depression. And we, based on how well they're doing, we would actually, and exposed to adversity, we would say that they are resilient. Well, this paper actually pointed out that a subset of those individuals that we classify as resilient, when we look at them on measures of physiological functioning, they actually have problems, physical health problems. And so what this paper show is that there is this physiological wear and tear on the body, which we often finding from this research actually transformed the field, because it shows that there was a biological cause for resilient adaptation among certain a group of people. And so some of the people that we usually classify as resilient, although they're looking well on the outside, when you look on the inside, there is actually a physiological dysfunction. And this is not the first time that researchers have actually seen this. Earlier work in 1993, I believe, look at Black individuals from low-income families or low-income conditions. And they show that if certain individuals from that group use this high effortful control, that this self-determination to succeed, those individuals tend to have higher rates of hypertension. But if the same Black individuals from high SES actually use this high effortful control coping strategies, they tend to have lower rates of hypertension. So we have always seen that exposure to adversity and time with coping seems to have certain effects on physiological outcome. So in Brody's work, he pretty much tests youth's allostatic functioning at age 19, because Allostatic load is the physiological wear and tear of the body. And unfortunately, as you grow older, this allostatic load accumulates. But I wanted to understand at what age do these patterns of poor health and pathological allostatic load actually emerge, and what developmental period is possible to create interventions that promote positive health outcomes and or delay these disparities that we see occurring in children and adolescents. And so I decided to look at this study of profiles looking at risk, allostatic load, and mental health outcome in lower income children. And I investigated these patterns in low-income children, but because resilience theory suggests that certain vulnerabilities and protective factors can lead to different patterns of adaptation, I examined how childhood maltreatment, emotional regulation, and affect and personality characteristic would be associated with these profiles of risk, allostatic load, and mental health. And for this study, participants included 491 low-income children that was between ages 8 to 12 who attended a research summer camp in urban city in northeastern United States. And the sample was fairly diverse. About 68% of the sample was Black, and about 21% of the youth were from Latin background. 52% of the youth were female, so there was like an almost even split between females and males, and about 54% of these youth actually had some experience of childhood maltreatment. And I run several models using this program, this statistical approach called latent profile analysis to try to create 6 distinct profiles. And what we saw emerge was that there was 2 low risk group. And when I mean low risk, these are kids compared to other kids in their group, they didn't report a lot of like adversity, okay? And so you had a low risk group with no mental health or physical health concern. You had a low risk group with mental health concerns. But I want to point out that compared to other like population, the general population, these kids are experiencing more risk than the average population would. And then there was a high-risk group. There was a high-risk group with no mental or physical health concerns, and we usually refer to that as the resilience group because they've been exposed to adversity, but there's no mental or physical health concerns. And then you have a high risk with mental health problems. And then you have a high risk with no mental health problems, but they had physical health concerns. This is the physiological dysregulation group. And then you had a group that had high risk, but have both mental and physical health problems. Fortunately, only 8 of the kids in that group had that high risk with mental and physical health concern. And I actually see this as a positive that in general, kids are resilient and you're not seeing a lot of these high rates of physiological dysregulation in these youth. And you shouldn't. We hope we shouldn't see these types of rates in children. But there is evidence to suggest that these patterns are actually emerging at a young age in marginalized samples because there were some youths that this profile, physiological dysregulation was evident in. Then I actually look at differences in these profiles, and we found significant differences in childhood maltreatment, emotional regulation, and affect. In general, the high-risk groups, the 4 high-risk groups, reported higher rates of childhood maltreatment than the low-risk groups. However, both the low-risk group with no mental health and physical health concern and the resilient group, that high risk with no mental health and physical health concerns, they reported better emotional regulation and affect scores than those with high risk and have mental health problems. And interestingly, one of the things that you will see is the group in the far right, where they had high risk with physical health concern. And what we found was that these groups, in addition to the resilient group and the low risk group, actually had significant difference in their effect. And in fact, when you compare all their negative effect scores, this group actually shows the lowest negative effect scores in the group. And this is consistent with a theory that I have that is one of the pathways to physiological dysregulation is the suppression of negative emotions. That is the fact that people who engage in negative emotion, that suppress their negative emotion and experience a lot of adversity, tend to actually have heightened physiological responses that can then lead to poor physical health. And I will talk about one of the mechanisms towards that in our next study. So for personality characteristic, we found differences for ego resiliency, conscientiousness, agreeableness, and neuroticism. The low risk and the resilient group with no mental and physical health concerns, these kids tend to report higher ego resiliency. That means that they're able to modify their emotions when faced with different types of environmental stressors. They were highly intelligent, so high conscientiousness, and they had lower levels of emotional instability when we compare that to kids that were high risk with and had mental health problems. And so in general, what this shows is that there is kids that is on this early trajectory to physiological dysregulation. And one of the differences that we can actually see is that they tend to show a lot of positive effect, but they tend to also suppress their negative emotions. So some of the strategies to promote good mental and physical health include getting sufficient sleep. We should always strive to get 8 hours of sleep. One of the things that we know from the literature is among every mental health concern that we could possibly think of, sleep is the culprit. So too much sleep, depression, inability to stay asleep, or not have enough sleep is associated with anxiety. And so we should try our best to sleep more. And then when you're dealing with stressful experience, it's important to seek therapeutic help, like go to therapy, and engage in exercise, eat healthy and nutritious food. And one of the things that I want to emphasize and I'm going to talk about this in my next study, is to maintain close relationship with your family and friends. When we look at different resilience factors in the literature, the two most potent resilient factor that we can see is social support, having social support, and also good, effective parenting. That seems to protect you from different negative stressful experiences. Okay, so it's important to maintain close relationships with your family and friends. So my lab and I have been interested in understanding what mechanisms could explain different mental and physical health outcomes among youth who were actually exposed to adversity or stressful life experiences. And one of the mechanisms that I actually like to look at is coping. And when specifically, we want to know, how does the coping strategies you'd actually engage in influence their health, well-being, and coping with stress? And so one of our recent papers actually look at how a child's relationship with their parents influence how they actually cope with racial ethnic discrimination. And so we know in the United States that many marginalized groups continue to experience racial discrimination. It's more covert than ever before. And racial discrimination refers to the unequal treatment of individuals or groups based on their race and ethnicity. Racial discrimination tend to negatively and disproportionately affect Black Americans. In a survey that was given by Pew Research Center in 2024, 75% of Black adults reported experience racial discrimination. Among that group, 13% actually says they experience racial discrimination regularly, and about 62% of them report experiences occasionally. But I do want to note that these rates differ significantly among minority groups based on what is happening in the socio-political context. For example, Asian Americans have reported similar rates of discrimination as Black individuals, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic. So I also want you to think about how immigrants and Latina individuals at the moment might be exposed to a higher level of racial discrimination because of the current sociopolitical climate. So one form of racial discrimination is racial ethnic microaggression. And compared to covert racial discrimination, REMS, or we call it REMS, are subtle, often unintentional or unconscious forms of racial discrimination. And as depicted in this image here, people of color are often perceived as being more likely to engage in criminal activities or be perceived as second-class citizen. So in this instance, where we see this white woman being in the elevator and a Black man entered in a nicely dressed outfit and who is smaller than her size, when she sees him, she immediately clenches her purse because she believes that he's going to actually steal from her. Okay, and so this is a form of racial ethnic microaggression. And exposure to REMS has huge mental health implication. What we've seen in the literature is that children and adults who are exposed to higher levels of REMS are more likely to report lower self-esteem, poor academic performance, poor physical health and mental health. We see higher rates of anxiety, depression, substance use, and a plethora of different things. And in fact, REMS, racial ethnic microaggression, can be somewhat more damaging than covert racial discrimination because people spend a lot of time ruminating about, is this event racist or not? And so they spend a lot of time, mental power, focusing on trying to figure out whether this incident that happened to them is racist. To navigate these types of racial ethnic microaggressions, youth of color engage in a range of coping strategies. And some of these coping strategies can be adaptive or maladaptive based on the fit between the environmental stressor and the coping mechanism. So when I talk about the fit between environmental stressor, I want you to think about the fact that problem-focused coping, that is, when you have experience a stressful situation or dealing with a challenge, you might actually think that I have to find a solution to actually deal with this problem, and that is usually a good thing. However, if you broke up with a partner from an unhealthy situation, engaging problem-focused coping is actually not adaptive because you're then trying to find a solution to stay in an unhealthy situation that's going to be detrimental to you. So a more appropriate coping response would be to engage in distraction coping, where you can focus on other healthy things and not trying to find a solution to stay in a relationship. And so the environmental fit between the stressor and the coping mechanism is what makes it adaptive. Now, coping is defined as cognitive and behavioral efforts to manage demands that exceed a person's resources. And in general, what we've seen is that Black people use different coping strategies to actually deal with stress that everybody actually experience, and race-based stress. And two of these strategies that we often engage in are expressive suppression and collective coping. What is expressive suppression? Expressive suppression is the conscious inhibition of emotions or emotional expression. And Black families, unfortunately, often encourage their children, fortunately and unfortunately, often encourage their children to engage in inhibiting their emotions as a use of survival, okay? For it's often served as a survival strategy to help children navigate racially unsafe environments in the United States. In the short term, this is perceived as an adaptive response because it ensures the survival or safety of children in oppressive environments. Unfortunately, in the long term, it can be harmful because it's associated with internal physiological arousal, which again goes back to the fact that when we see a bunch of negative effect, kids are actually engaging in a lot of negative effect, it's related to more physiological dysregulation, because engaging in inhibiting your emotion leads to physiological arousal and then ultimately leads to mental and physical health outcomes. In contrast to expressive suppression, collective coping is grounded in Afrocentric values. That is, we are taught in Black communities to rely on people and our community and seek support during times of stress. And that seems to be more adaptive. Now, one of the things that we know when it comes to coping is that parenting plays a key role in the development of adaptive coping strategies. And this is consistent with a theory called attachment theory that suggests that infants seek comfort from their caregivers when they're distressed. And the stronger the child's confidence is and trust in the caregiver's availability and responsiveness to them, especially in times of stress, the more secure a child will actually feel in that relationship. So from early experiences with caregivers, children actually learn how they should think and feel about themselves and others. Am I worthy of love? Can I go to people and trust them if I need something? Okay. Are other people trustworthy? And this mental map or internal working model tend to guide their thoughts and behaviors later in development. So our early attachment patterns with caregivers actually shape how individuals manage stress later in life. That is, a securely attached person who knows that they're worthy of love and know that they can actually count on other people may cope more effectively and maintain better mental health because they have greater confidence that they are going to receive support from their support networks and cope and are able to use more effective coping strategy in times of stress. Whereas a person who is insecure may actually experience heightened stress response because they can't seem to rely on other people when they're dealing with different types of stress. And so research has actually shown that when faced with discrimination, youth who have higher levels of parental warmth or nurturing parenting tend to have better developmental outcomes. But there's not a lot of research that focuses on attachment security itself. And so that is what we were trying to do, trying to understand how attachment security kind of influenced the association between racial ethnic microaggression and coping, and how this might actually vary against youth gender. And I want to point out that none of the findings regarding gender was significant. So these findings that I'm about to talk about was consistent among boys and girls. So the sample for this study actually include 230 Black emerging adults who actually live in the DMV area. This study was affluent, with the majority having mothers who had a Black bachelor degree or higher. And on average, participant family income was around $62,000. And so when we ask the question, do experiences of racial ethnic microaggression predict youth coping responses? We found that racial ethnic microaggression in these youths was positively associated with collective coping, but it was not with expression suppression. So in actuality, kids, Black emerging adults here, is actually when they encounter racial ethnic microaggression, they tend to rely on their community in times of stress. We also found that both mothers and fathers' attachment was positively associated with collective coping. That is, if you have strong relationships with your mothers and fathers, that tend to influence your engagement in being more likely to rely on other people, your community, when you're experiencing racial discrimination. But only mother-child attachment was associated with expressive suppression. So if you had a good relationship with your mother, you were less likely to inhibit your emotions. Mother and child attachment, but not father-child attachment, also moderate this association between REMS and collective coping, such that Black emerging adults who reported experiencing high levels of racial ethnic microaggression and had high levels of mother-child attachment, had supportive relationship with their mothers, were more likely to use collective coping than compared to other emerging adults. And both mothers and fathers' child attachment moderate this association between REMS and expressive suppression, such that Black emerging adults who reported experience high levels of racial ethnic microaggression, but doesn't have strong relationship with their mothers and fathers, were more likely to engage in inhibiting their emotions compared to other kids who experience high levels of ethnic racial migration and had parents who they had supportive relationship with. So in some, emerging adults who were exposed to high levels of racial discrimination were more likely to seek support and resources from their community when experiencing distress. Those who had stronger attachment with their mothers and fathers tend to rely more on their communities for support in times of stress. And Black emerging adults who experience high levels of racial ethnic microaggression but had strong attachment bonds with their mothers were more likely to engage in more adaptive coping strategies. They were more likely to use collective coping. However, weak mother-youth attachment or father-youth attachment increases the likelihood that an individual would actually suppress their emotions or use maladaptive coping strategies to deal with racial ethnic discrimination. So in all, strong attachment bonds with mothers and fathers can protect youth from maladaptive coping strategies when they're exposed to racial ethnic microaggression. And so my last slide is the strategies to promote adaptive coping and improve well-being. We need to encourage children to express their emotions in healthy ways and in safe environments. I know a lot of the times that we, in Black communities, you often hear us telling our kids to not express negative emotions and to keep it in. That is good in unsafe environment, but when they're in safe environments, kids should actually be encouraged to express their emotions because this decreases internal physiological arousal, okay? We should also encourage children and adults to seek out support from their loved ones and trusted individuals in times of stress. We should teach parents how to foster trust and communication with their children, because having these strong relationships with their caregiver matters to children. And finally, systematically, regardless of what's happening in this country, we need to challenge and educate individuals about the effects of discrimination and implicit bias, because those experiences are having negative effect on people's mental health. And so that is one of the ways that we are going to actually help others, by targeting this systematically. So in closing, I want to thank our participants that participate in our studies, my collaborators, research assistants, and all of you for actually listening to my presentation.
Thank you. Are there any questions for Dr. Tyrell? That was a lot of information, a lot of good information.
I have a quick question, if that's okay.
Yes.
Well, actually, too, I would love to follow you guys on Instagram, but the QR code doesn't seem to be working for me. If somebody could drop in the chat what your name is on Instagram so that you can be found.
So my Instagram doesn't have my name, it's my Racklame. I'm actually off Instagram.
Gotcha.
RACCLAB is our lab name that you can find on Instagram.
Thank you for sharing that. And then my question was, I was just curious, do you guys hope to do, for your first study, any follow-ups in other states? Especially because you mentioned you guys did that in California, right? And I'm in Virginia, so just thinking about how different that must be for each population, especially based on if they lived there or if they moved there as well. it's amazing how you guys are able to control and go through all so much. So like, thank you so much for sharing. This is really fascinating stuff. But I was just curious what you thought of that.
Yeah, so yeah, context. That's why my lab is called context, resilient adaptation and across culture and context, because context matters, right? And so depending on the context, these findings might look differently. But one of the things that we have seen across different research is that like if you if you display these messages in the context of a warm and loving and supportive parenting, you will see a positive developmental outcomes. Okay. And this is consistently across different studies that have been actually done in different parts of the United States. That is, if you engage in these socialization messages and you do this in the context of warm, in fact, you can look at work by Rihanna Elsie Anderson and Howard Stevenson, where they actually engaged in the idea of the talk, and they try to teach parents how to effectively engage in the talk that would actually allow there to be more positive developmental outcomes. So there is actually interventions that focus on how parents actually should communicate with their children when it comes to talking about like race and discrimination.
That's so cool. Thank you. And then if it's okay if I ask just one more quick question, do you guys happen to have any like practical packets or one sheets or guides? Because I think your work is fascinating. I think what I would love to learn more from your findings is how to apply that at like an individual level, if that makes sense. Mhm.
So we usually like post on our Instagram. Like we usually have my students summarize findings from our research and like post them on Instagram. There is I actually did like an infographic on based on the second study that is actually posted online for Mount Hope in Rochester. So there is an infographic that is on our website and also on Mount Hope Center for Families website that provides not only the findings but some practical like tips. So we do try to disseminate this information to a broader audience besides being in journals. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you so
Right
much.
now we don't have like what you're talking about. Yeah, pamphlets.
Dr. Tyrell, we had a question in the chat. Do you think the higher rates of anxiety you found were due to more time spent prepping for discrimination than the other groups, or from actually facing more discrimination than those groups?
So that's a very awesome question. And it doesn't look like it because discrimination was actually included in the model as a covariate. So we actually control for people's discrimination experiences, and we still saw that pattern in the results. So discrimination was accounted for in the model.
Great. Any other final questions? Okay. Well, Dr. Tyrell, we thank you so much. We thank you and the University of Maryland for bringing this really fascinating information to us today. We want to thank all of you for joining us for today's webinar. We hope that you'll join us next month for the children's webinar on December 18th for managing holiday stress. We're also really excited to announce that the Children's Mental Health Matters campaign annual poster contest is now live. So we are partnering with the Maryland Department of Health and 988, and with the contest theme of No Judgment, Just Help, encouraging Maryland students up to age 18 to submit artwork that promotes openness, challenges stigma, and inspires others to seek help when needed. So please share that with any children that you know, any of your organizations, of fellow educators. We look forward to working with all of you to support families and communities across Maryland. If you have any questions, please reach out to us at info@cmhm.mhamd.org. And thanks again for joining us, and have a great rest of your week.